Imagine waking up to discover that a deal shaping the destiny of an entire continent for 25 years has simply vanished overnight. No countdown, no warning, no grand announcement, just silence. Factories that were once full of movement now stand still. Workers who once believed they had a future built on stability now watch that promise fade. That is what happened when AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, quietly expired. A trade deal that once symbolized hope and cooperation between the United States and Africa is now history. But behind this quiet ending lies a louder question. What does this really mean for Africa, for America, and for the balance of power in a world already shifting fast? AGOA was never just about trade. It was about identity, trust, and opportunity. For 2.5 decades, it gave more than 30 African countries access to the largest consumer market on Earth, the United States. It allowed African goods to enter America without the heavy taxes that often make trade impossible. It was supposed to be a bridge between two worlds, one rich and industrialized, the other young, dynamic, and still rising. For a while, it worked. Countries like Kenya, Lesotho, and Ethiopia saw their industries expand. Millions of jobs were created. Women found work in textile factories. Small businesses began to dream of exporting their products to places they had only seen on television. And in that moment, it felt as if a new chapter had begun, one where Africa was no longer seen only as a place of need, but as a partner. But behind every deal lies a deeper truth. AGOA was not charity, it was strategy. When it was created in 2000, Washington was trying to counter a growing fear that Africa would slip further into poverty and instability, and that other global powers would fill the vacuum. The US wanted to maintain influence, to keep African markets aligned with Western systems of trade and governance. The deal came with conditions. Countries that wanted to benefit had to follow certain political and economic standards. They had to hold elections, protect human rights, and maintain a form of democracy approved by Washington. On paper, that sounded good. In practice, it meant that AGOA was never purely about economics. It was also a political tool. Over time, that tension grew. African leaders began to ask why the same countries preaching free trade were also the ones setting so many rules. They noticed that even with AGOA, Africa was still exporting mostly raw materials and importing finished products, the same old pattern that kept wealth flowing out of the continent. Factories that made clothing or basic goods did well, but very few African industries reached the next level of value-added production. And while AGOA opened doors, it also reinforced old dependencies. Many nations realized that if Washington pulled the plug, everything could collapse. And now, that's exactly what has happened. The expiration of AGOA wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of shifting priorities. The United States is now more inward-looking, focused on its domestic economy, competition with China, and political divisions at home. Africa, once seen as a strategic frontier, no longer gets the same level of attention in Washington's debates. Renewal of AGOA was delayed again and again, caught between political disagreements and budget battles. Some lawmakers claimed the deal didn't deliver enough results. Others said it unfairly benefited certain countries over others. By the time the deadline came, no one in Congress was ready to fight for it. So the deal simply died. For Africa, the timing couldn't be worse. Many economies are struggling with inflation, high debt, and the aftershocks of global conflicts that have disrupted supply chains. For small nations that relied heavily on exports to the US, losing AGOA means losing lifelines. Take Lesotho, a tiny country where textile exports under AGOA once made up almost half the national income. Thousands of workers there, mostly women, are now facing layoffs. In Kenya, factories that produced apparel for US brands are cutting back production. Ghana's cocoa exporters, who hope to expand into value-added chocolate manufacturing, are now facing higher costs that could push them out of the market. Across the continent, the same question repeats: what happens next? But here's where the story gets even more interesting. While Washington's attention drifts, another power is moving fast: China. Beijing has been building roads, ports, railways, and entire industrial zones across Africa. Chinese investment doesn't come with political lectures. It comes with loans, deals, and visible infrastructure. Many African leaders now see China as a partner that delivers results. With AGOA gone, that perception will only grow stronger. Trade between Africa and China already dwarfs that between Africa and the United States. And now, the gap is likely to widen further. In many ways, the end of AGOA may become the moment historians look back on and say, this was when Africa's economic loyalty began to shift decisively eastward. Still, not everyone sees it as a loss. Some African economists argue that AGOA was always a temporary solution, a deal designed more for U.S. political convenience than Africa's long-term empowerment. They believe its end could be an opportunity for the continent to rethink its trade relationships, to focus more on internal markets and regional integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, has already begun connecting African nations to trade more among themselves, rather than depending on overseas partners. If Africa can make that work, the loss of AGOA might push it toward true independence. Yet the road ahead won't be easy. Many African industries depend on the stability and predictability that AGOA provided. Without it, exporters will face tariffs that make their products more expensive and less competitive. Building new trade systems, whether with China, Europe, or within Africa itself, will take years. And there's another question: trust. After 2 decades of promises and cooperation, how will African nations view America now? Will they see it as a partner that lost interest, or as a friend that turned away when things got complicated? In the months before AGOA's expiration, quiet conversations were taking place in ministries and boardrooms across Africa. Leaders and business owners were anxious, but still hopeful that Washington would renew the agreement. Many remembered how, in previous years, the U.S. had proudly described AGOA as the cornerstone of its relationship with Africa. There were speeches about partnership, cooperation, and shared prosperity. So the expectation was simple: surely America would not just let it die. But as the deadline drew closer, it became clear that the sense of urgency in Africa was not matched in Washington. Lawmakers were focused on elections, budget debates, and other issues. Africa, once again, was not at the top of the agenda. When the deal finally expired, the shock spread fast. African newspapers carried headlines filled with disbelief. Business groups called emergency meetings. Economists warned of potential job losses. In Lesotho, workers gathered outside factories demanding answers. Many of them had never heard of AGOA until it was gone. To them, it wasn't a law. It was their paycheck, their children's school fees, their food on the table. And just like that, it was over. For an ordinary worker, the impact is personal, not political. Imagine a young woman in a garment factory in Kenya. For years, she earned a modest but stable income sewing clothes destined for American stores. She was proud that something made by her hands could reach a global market. Her work gave her independence and hope. Then one day, her manager announces that orders have been cut in half. Costs are rising because the products no longer qualify for duty-free access. Soon, layoffs begin. She goes home uncertain about how she will pay rent or feed her family. For her, AGOA isn't about geopolitics or trade policy, it's about survival. Across the continent, similar stories are unfolding. Small farmers who once exported fruit and flowers to U.S. markets now face tariffs that make them less competitive. Entrepreneurs who started businesses hoping to benefit from global supply chains are seeing contracts canceled. The ripple effects go beyond trade. They affect education, healthcare, and community development. Many African economies are interconnected, and when one sector suffers, others follow. In Washington, the conversation is far less emotional. Some politicians argue that AGOA didn't achieve enough to justify its continuation. They claim that African exports under the deal were still limited to a narrow range of products and that the overall trade balance remained small. Critics say the U.S. gained little in return for granting duty-free access. Others argue that AGOA didn't create the kind of political influence Washington expected. African countries have continued to build strong relationships with China, Russia, and the Middle East. To some lawmakers, that was proof that AGOA had failed as a diplomatic tool. But that argument misses the bigger picture. Trade is not just about numbers, it's about trust. For many African countries, AGOA was a symbol, proof that cooperation with the U.S. could lead to tangible benefits. It represented an open door. Now that door has closed, and reopening it will not be easy. The end of AGOA leaves behind not only economic uncertainty but also a sense of betrayal. Africa's leaders have spent years aligning their economies with Western standards, believing that partnership with the U.S. was worth the effort. When the U.S. walked away without renewal, It sent a message louder than any speech could deliver, that Africa was no longer a priority. Meanwhile, China is quietly strengthening its presence. New trade agreements, infrastructure loans, and cultural exchanges are reshaping Africa's economic map. The Belt and Road Initiative continues to expand ports, highways, and digital networks. For many African governments, Beijing is offering what Washington no longer seems willing to provide: predictable investment and consistent attention. It's not perfect, there are concerns about debt and dependency. But it feels reliable. And in international relations, reliability is power. Europe, too, is trying to reassert influence. The European Union has launched programs to counterbalance China's growth, focusing on green energy and digital infrastructure. But European regulations often make trade with Africa complex and expensive. African leaders are beginning to see that their future lies not in depending on one external power, but in building collective strength at home. The African Continental Free Trade Area is one of the most ambitious projects ever attempted on the continent. It aims to create a single market of more than 1 billion people, breaking down the borders that have long limited trade between neighboring nations. If it succeeds, it could reshape Africa's position in the world, turning the continent from an exporter of raw materials into a hub of manufacturing, innovation, and regional cooperation. Yet, success will require vision, leadership, and unity, things that have often been in short supply. Still, there's a sense of determination rising. The end of AGOA may hurt in the short term, but it could also light a spark. Across Africa, entrepreneurs are learning to adapt. They are exploring new markets in Asia, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. Technology is creating new opportunities that don't rely on traditional trade routes. Young Africans are building apps, designing clothing brands, and starting online businesses that reach customers directly. The spirit of innovation is alive, and perhaps stronger now because necessity is forcing creativity. For the U.S., this is a moment of reflection. Washington faces a choice: to rebuild its relationship with Africa on new terms, or to risk losing relevance in a region that will shape the 21st century. Africa's population is booming. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. The continent is rich in resources, from lithium and cobalt used in electric cars to the agricultural land needed to feed the world. Ignoring Africa now would be a strategic mistake. The question is whether the U.S. understands that in time. Some American analysts are already calling for a new version of AGOA, one that focuses more on investment, technology transfer, and mutual growth. They argue that trade deals should be built on partnership, not dependency. Instead of simply giving market access, the U.S. could collaborate on building industries that create jobs in both regions. Others say the old model should be replaced with direct private sector investment rather than government programs. The truth may lie somewhere in between. In the end, the death of AGOA is not just the story of a trade agreement, it's the story of shifting global influence. Africa is no longer a silent player waiting for handouts. It is becoming a stage where the world's powers compete for trust and opportunity. The end of one chapter may simply mark the beginning of another. For years, AGOA represented a promise: the idea that partnership between Africa and the United States could be fair, practical, and beneficial to both sides. That promise may have ended with a quiet expiration, but its story is far from over. Because when one bridge collapses, others begin to rise. The end of AGOA is not just a signal of what has failed, it is a mirror reflecting what still needs to change. It shows us the distance between political words and economic realities, between promises made and promises kept. In many ways, Africa has spent decades waiting for the world to decide what it wants from the continent. One generation saw aid programs, another saw peacekeeping missions, another saw trade agreements that were meant to bring opportunity. Yet through all of it, the fundamental question remained the same: when will Africa stop being the background of someone else's strategy and start being the author of its own story? That moment might be now. The end of AGOA has forced Africa to confront its dependency on external approval. It has revealed how fragile a system can be when it is built on the decisions of others. For too long, African economies were told to open their markets, to liberalize, to follow models designed elsewhere. And while some progress was made, much of the value still left the continent. Raw materials were exported, finished goods were imported, jobs were created, but not enough to keep up with a rapidly growing population. AGOA softened that imbalance but never truly fixed it. The future must be different. Africa's leaders now face a defining choice: continue chasing short-term deals that depend on foreign approval, or invest in building long-term strength through unity, technology, and education. The African Continental Free Trade Area could become the foundation of that strength if nations commit to it fully. Imagine a continent where a product made in Ghana is easily sold in Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa, without barriers, without tariffs, without endless paperwork. Imagine factories across the continent working together, supplying parts to each other instead of competing for the same limited contracts abroad. That is not just a dream, it's a vision already being built. For the ordinary African worker, that vision means hope. It means that losing AGOA is not the end of opportunity, but the beginning of independence. It means that a tailor in Nairobi, a coffee farmer in Ethiopia, or a metalworker in Accra could one day rely more on fellow Africans than distant markets. True development does not come from a single trade agreement. It comes from confidence, the belief that Africa's destiny does not have to be negotiated in foreign capitals. Still, none of this will be easy. Old habits die hard, and the global economy is not built to favor the weak. The world's richest countries still control most of the financial systems, supply chains, and technologies that drive modern trade. But every transformation begins with awareness. And Africa's awareness is growing. The continent is young. More than 60% of Africans are under the age of 25. They are connected, informed, ambitious, and impatient for change. They are not satisfied with being told what to do or waiting for policies drafted abroad. They are ready to build their own future, one invention, one business, one idea at a time. America, too, has a decision to make. If it wants to remain relevant in Africa, it must understand that the era of one-sided partnerships is over. The new generation of African leaders and citizens expects respect, not lectures, collaboration, not conditions. They want trade that builds industries, not aid that builds dependence. They want investment that creates jobs on both sides of the ocean. If the United States can adapt to this reality, there is still time to rebuild trust. But that trust will not be restored through speeches, it will be earned through action. In the coming years, global competition for Africa's attention will intensify. China will continue investing. Russia will seek influence. The Middle East will expand trade. Europe will push for green partnerships. And the United States will have to decide whether it will lead with genuine partnership or watch from the sidelines. The end of AGOA might be painful, but it has made one thing clear: Africa now has options. And options mean power. The question that matters most is not whether the United States will return with a new trade deal. The real question is whether Africa will be ready to negotiate on its own terms. That will require discipline, transparency, and a shared sense of purpose. It will require leaders who think beyond election cycles and citizens who hold them accountable. It will require education systems that prepare young Africans for the industries of tomorrow, not the jobs of yesterday. It will require investment in technology, energy, and agriculture that puts African innovation at the center of global progress. And yes, it will require patience, but not the kind of patience that waits for help. The kind that builds, step by step, until the foundation is strong enough to stand without fear of collapse. In the quiet that followed AGOA's expiration, many thought Africa had lost something irreplaceable. But perhaps what was really lost was an illusion, the belief that prosperity could be gifted rather than earned. The end of AGOA is painful because it reminds us that progress built on someone else's approval can disappear overnight. But it also reminds us of Africa's greatest strength: resilience. Time and again, this continent has faced setbacks and still found a way to rise. Maybe this is another one of those moments. Across Africa, you can feel a subtle shift. It's in the determination of entrepreneurs building businesses from the ground up. It's in the confidence of young professionals who believe they can compete globally. It's in the growing pride of communities that no longer want to depend on what others decide for them. That spirit is what will define Africa's future, not the policies of Washington or Beijing, but the will of its own people for America. This should be a moment of humility and rediscovery. If it truly wants to engage Africa, it must listen, not dictate. It must recognize that partnership in the 21st century means equality, not hierarchy. The world has changed. Africa has changed. The time of quiet dependency is ending, and a new era of assertive cooperation is beginning. When history looks back at the collapse of AGOA, It may not remember the legal details or the policy debates. It will remember how Africa responded. Did it retreat in disappointment, or did it rise with determination? That answer will define more than just trade. It will define the future balance of global power. So yes, AGOA is gone. The trade deal that once connected Africa and the West has reached its final chapter. But in its ending lies a new beginning, a call for Africa to take ownership of its story, to turn vulnerability into strength, and to show the world that partnership cannot survive without respect. The silence that followed AGOA's death is temporary. What comes next will be written in the voices of those who refuse to be silent, the young minds, the entrepreneurs, the leaders who believe that Africa's time is not coming, it has already arrived. And when they speak, the world will have no choice but to listen. And that's the end of this video, so if you guys like the information I put in this video, then don't forget to like and subscribe my channel. See you in a next video. Goodbye.